email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Joining me today on The Conversation is Craig Weber. He's the founder of the Weber Consulting Group, an alliance of experts who help cultivate more effective managers and leaders and then help them build healthier and more adaptive organizations by treating dialogue as a discipline. More on that to come. He's also the author of the best-selling book, Conversational Capacity, How to Build Your Conversational Capacity, Do Meaningful Work, and Make a Difference. Craig, thank you so much for joining me on The Conversation today.
Hey, thank you for having me.
It's my pleasure. I like to think of all the people who come on the show as superheroes, and everybody knows that superheroes always have a backstory or an origin story. So what is your origin story? How'd you get to write the book, found the company, do the work you're doing?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I talk about this in the introduction of my second book. I get asked, how did I get into this work? And I think it started early on, at least the seeds were planted. My father worked for the post office, and I used to listen to him come home from work, sit at the table and talk about, bad supervisors, colleagues who acted like pain, difficult customers, et cetera. And I remember thinking, why in the world would you ever get a job? It sounds like a miserable way to spend time. I think the seeds were planted there, and then worked with a colleague or a partner at a small business here in Southern California. And I was young and didn't know what I wanted to do, and started reading books like 1 Minute Manager and In Search of Excellence back in the mid 80s, and got kind of interested in the field of corporate education. So went back to school, studied organizational development and organizational psychology, and eventually started my own consulting practice.
Oh, very nice. So what really inspired you to write Conversational Capacity and its sequel, Influence in Action?
I've always been a voracious reader. I love reading. And, the idea of these ideas I know work. And so how do you get those ideas out there into the world in a, bigger, more broader way? And writing a book seemed like a natural way to do that. So a great way to call attention to a set of ideas I've seen make a tangible difference in a lot of people's lives and in a lot of organizations over the years. So,
right.
And I like to write. I think the best way to kind of learn your own material is to actually write about it. And so people think you start a book and you come up with the idea and write a book and you're done. But really the process of writing a book, the ideas get more and more refined because it really forces you to grapple with the ideas. So kind of a powerful learning experience to write a book if you really put in the effort.
Yeah, I've written two as well, and one was quite easy, and one was like not as easy. So I've been there. But today, I'm gonna mostly focus on, your book, Conversational Capacity. I know you've written a second one, so please feel free to throw anything in there from that one that you feel is appropriate. But I read this one. I didn't read the other one yet, so I'll get to that one eventually. So the title is Conversational Capacity. Can you what is that? How do you define what is conversational capacity? I assume it's not just the ability to talk nonstop. I assume that's not it.
That's definitely not it. So it's a capacity. So I'll give you two definitions, two ways of thinking about it. One is it's the ability. This could be of an individual or an entire team of people. So it's an interesting framework in that it's both an individual and a collective competence. But it's the ability to have constructive, learning-focused dialogue about difficult subjects in challenging circumstances, and you could say across tough boundaries, cultural boundaries, personality boundaries, geographic boundaries, functional boundaries, you name it. And so a way to think about it is if you have a team with high conversational capacity, that team can put its most challenging issues on the table in a meeting and do exceptionally great work around them. Whereas if you look at a team with low conversational capacity, a minor difference of opinion will often derail a meeting. So sort of a foundational competence that breathes life into any activity in an organization, a team, or a project that requires people communicate and collaborate for its effectiveness. But it's this baseline competence we're often not paying much attention to, partly because we lack good, rigorous constructs or even making sense of it. And then there's this second way of thinking about the concept, and it's a little more operational. And I talk about high conversational capacity as the ability, again, of an individual or a team of people to converse with each other in what I call the sweet spot in a conversation. And the sweet spot is that place, say, in a meeting or a conversation where two critical variables are in balance. And on the one hand, if you're in a room full of people with high conversational capacity, You're not wondering what people are thinking about the issue you're wrestling with or the decision you're trying to make, because candor is extremely high. That's important. But unfiltered, unfettered candor is not a good thing. And so in the sweet spot, that candor is balanced with lots of curiosity. People are open-minded, they're inquisitive, they're intellectually humble, they're eager to learn. And that is a good place to operate. People are being open, direct, and honest, but at the same time, they're intellectually humble and eager to learn and inquisitive. That's the sweet spot. And what tends to happen under pressure when you have low conversational capacity is people and teams begin to trigger out of that sweet spot. Some people start shutting down. Some people start heating up. So you can define conversational capacity as the ability to stay candid and curious under pressure.
That's a great definition. And we're going to come back to some of those other words you mentioned, like sweet spot, and I'll throw a couple other in, like minimize and a couple other things. So that's a great introduction. What are some of the symptoms of low conversational capacity?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Two basic symptoms tend to crop up in a team or an organization or a project when conversational capacity is low. They kind of are like blinking red lights that signal warning, danger, we're in over our heads here. And one of the symptoms, one of those red flashing lights, are undiscussable issues in a group or a team. So I often, when I'm doing a workshop, I'll ask the group, how many of you have been in a meeting where, if you think back on it, the most useful part of the meeting was the break? So because people are talking in the hallway, they're talking in the restroom, but they're not talking in the meeting. So that's one symptom conversational capacity is low, is undiscussable issues. Those issues that are far more likely to come up in the parking lot after work than in the meeting. And that's a sign of low candor, right? So we're out of the sweet spot. Candor is low. People aren't talking about stuff they should be talking. The other side of it, when it's low curiosity, are unproductively discussable issues. Yeah, they come up, but it isn't pretty. The conversations spark far more heat than light. You see people arguing, bickering, headbutting, getting increasingly testy because curiosity is low. High candor, low curiosity, and we're arguing. If we're out of the sweet spot the other direction in low candor, we're not talking about things we should. So those are the two big symptoms you want to watch for: undiscussable issues and unproductively discussable issues.
Okay, I'm gonna tie into that first one. In that, after reading the book, I just got to be honest. I don't think I want to get on a plane or spend any time in a hospital anytime soon.
Right.
For those of you who haven't read the book yet, he uses a lot of examples that are in the air and in the hospital where the outcome was suboptimal, all because of this lack of or low conversational capacity. Can you tell us I think we've covered them all, but we have what you call the sweet spot, and you have your conversational capacity. And then the two words I want to throw in there are minimizing and winning. So when you say somebody is minimizing or winning, what does that really mean? And why is it bad?
Yeah. So, yes, and to your point, I tend to use a lot of examples where it's high risk, high import situations to kind of drive home how powerful some of these reactions are. And staying in the sweet spot, candid and curious, is a fairly simple idea in concept. In practice, it's tough because our defensive emotional reactions work against us. And there's two big ones. You just named them: the need to minimize, the need to win, as we describe it. And the need to minimize, the idea would be, I walk into a meeting and I have a concern about a decision. I intend to speak up. I really do. I want to speak up. I want to say something. I want to put my 2 cents on the table. But then something inside says, hold back. Whoa. Pump the brakes here. You don't want to become a non-team player. You don't want to look like a malcontent. And so suddenly I begin to leave the sweet spot and become less and less candid, because what's getting triggered is a need to want to minimize the level of negative emotion, tension, discomfort, or risk in the conversation. So suddenly my need to play it safe begins to overwhelm my ability to be candid. And it's not a conscious choice. If I'm just choosing not to speak up, that's a choice. It's when I intend to speak up, I plan to speak up, I need to speak up, and I don't speak up. There's that need to minimize overwhelming my good intentions. So there's a really strong overlap here with the emotional intelligence research and amygdala hijack. I may walk into a meeting with a clear set of intentions, but my behavior goes in a different direction because my defensive emotional reaction hooks me and pulls me off my game. Now, the need to win, you asked about that. That's when I get pulled out of the sweet spot in the other direction. So I go into a meeting and I've got an idea and I put it on the table with the full intention of having a good collaborative dialogue to try to create a good idea. But as soon as someone disagrees with my thought or my view, instead of inquiring, instead of getting interested, instead of getting curious, I get argumentative. Because my need to win, to be right, to get my way, to sell my view, to get you to agree with me hooks me. And suddenly I'm all candor, no curiosity. I'm belittling your view. I'm talking over you. I'm rolling my eyes and making sarcastic comments, whatever it might be. So what we need to do if we want to build our conversational capacity is not turn off these defensive emotional reactions that need to minimize and that need to win. These are deep-seated emotional responses. They serve a purpose. We're not going to get rid of them. We need to learn to manage them more clearly. We talk about being able to catch it when you're being hooked by these tendencies so you can choose to respond in a more productive way. So someone reviewed my first book and said, online, conversational capacity is in essence operationalized emotional intelligence for exactly that reason. You're getting better and better and better over time at catching it quickly when you're being triggered so you can act in a way that is more in line with your good intentions. Yes, I'm being triggered, but I'm not going to let the fact that I'm triggered determine how I respond. Is that a helpful way of framing it?
Oh, 100%. And again, some of the stories are just phenomenal. The one that you started off the book with when you were in grade school and how you got, I guess, kind of frozen. And then even to the people, the person on the plane who they ended up crashing because they ran out of fuel and the guy didn't want to say anything about it to the guy. Those are kind of minimized, I guess. And the example of winning was when the second pilot didn't want to say anything to the first pilot because he was always being yelled at, and then it had a really bad effect.
Right. Yeah. Melbourne McBroom. That's right. A classic incident. United Airlines in 1978. Yeah. Portland, Oregon. Really aggressive, dominant pilot who had a strong win tendency. I'm right, you're wrong. If I want your opinion, I'll ask for it. And a co-pilot and flight engineer who were over on the minimize side, not speaking up. And yeah, as you mentioned, things did not work out well on the flight deck that day.
No, they did not. And I don't, I like the way you put it is these are base emotions. So it's not like we could even if we wanted to, we couldn't overcome them. That's wired into our DNA. And it doesn't make you a bad person. I am going to skip down a minute because there's another question you triggered when you said, and trigger's another word we'll talk about when you're talking about triggers and emotions. Let me find it here. Oh, so I saw one of your posts on LinkedIn about an airline worker screaming at the passengers, and you said someone needs to start keeping a trigger journal. Can you? So you say we need to learn to recognize our tendencies and triggers, and how can we do that?
That's a great question. Yeah. So that's one of probably the more popular practices we talk about in my workshops is learning to monitor and manage your defensive emotional reactions in a far more cogent way. So when you get triggered by your need to minimize or win, you can catch it at a 1 when it's barely tapping you on the shoulder and not when it's out here at a 10 and you're, in full meltdown. And so one of the things we talk about is keeping a trigger journal where you're in a meeting, someone says something and you get triggered by your need to minimize or win. You want to reflect on that at some point and ask yourself things like, what was the trigger? Was it their tone? Was it the issue? Or did I feel like they were being rude to someone I care about? What was the initial kind of thing that hooked me? How did I let it affect my behavior? Did I shut down when I probably should have said something? Did I say something when I really should have asked a question? So how did I let it kind of pull me off my game? And then what would be a better way to respond next time I'm triggered in this way? And the goal with this simple practice is not to catalog all your triggers. It's to get in the habit of noticing when you're being triggered. And that we find people who keep a trigger journal for a while, they get really good at what we call proactive trigger scanning, where I'm more conscious of the triggers, the things that might get me into trouble before I even go into the meeting. And so I'm kind of looking out ahead of me. I equate it with trail running. When I'm running on trail, I love trail running. I'm looking out ahead of me on trail for roots, rocks, and rattlesnakes. Well, the same thing when I got high conversational capacity. I'm looking out ahead of me in the conversation or meeting for those things that might throw me off my game.
Okay. So if you said you spent time in Atlanta, then you'll get this when you drive around here. When I was growing up, they taught you to look far in the future, far ahead to see what's happening. But in Atlanta, the roads are so bad. If you don't look right in front of your car, you're going to hit a pothole or it's going to break an axle. I mean, it's really bad.
Right. So you need sort of you need to go back and forth, I think, right? Look right ahead of
do.
you. Same thing with the trail. I need to look ahead of me to see what's going on up there, but I also need to pay attention to where my foot's going to land next, right? So you're constantly kind of switching back and forth between short and long-term focus. And I think conversationally, that's kind of what we're doing. I'm paying real strict attention to what's going on, what's coming out of my colleague's mouth right now. I want to pay attention to it so I can respond in a productive way. But I also need a longer distance view. What's the problem we're trying to solve here? What's the purpose of this meeting? What are we trying to get done here? And I think we need to kind of like your example of driving in Atlanta. I need to pay attention to the immediate stuff right there in front of me, but I also need to keep a sharp focus on the overarching goals for the exchange.
Yeah, in your example, you need to make sure that you're not stepping on a rattlesnake right in front of you, but you also got to make sure that bear is not coming down the trail towards you.
Absolutely. Right. Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Now, your book emphasizes building organizations that are, quote, good for people, business, and community, end quote. So can you share an example of a company you think really exemplifies this approach?
Yeah, there's a few of them out there that are really good at this, I think. I won't mention names here just to keep it private. Working with a couple of clients here who are taking this very seriously. And what they find is, higher conversational capacity helps them run the business in a more effective way. There's less friction, less dysfunction, less sterile conflict, because people are engaging with each other in a more constructive way. The nice thing is this translates into better people, right? You can't build a team or an organization with high conversational capacity unless people in the organization are investing. And routinely, what we hear from people is that this isn't just useful for me in the workplace, it's making a huge difference at home. Or I found this to be really helpful, someone recently said, in my relationship with my teenage daughter. So we find that people their spouses are commenting on you're not as emotionally volatile as you used to be. What's going on? I love that. So I think it's good for people and good for business. I also think that when you lock the door at night, people go home with these skills, and it doesn't just make a difference in their families. It makes a difference in their communities. I did work in Seattle recently, and one of the participants in the workshop said, I found this framework really useful in my work at a food bank at which I volunteer. Right? Because it's a lot of really smart people, are really passionate and care a lot, but that passion can go sideways really quickly when there's a disagreement. I found this really helpful in helping navigate kind of the work we're doing at volunteering at a food bank. And so I think you're a better citizen, you're a better neighbor, you're a better community member, you're a better family member, and you're also a better colleague, boss, or employee.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's the most powerful processes are the ones that can help you in the business, but also help you personally. Yeah. I know when I'm teaching project management, some people will come in at the end of the class and go, I can use this on my wedding. I can use this on this big event I'm having, in my personal life. And then you gave an example in the book on the personal level of a person that really was not trying. He was trying to connect with his daughter in a positive way, but because of this need to win, it ended up being, I think he was playing chess, if I recall, and his need to win actually overrode that. And he didn't, he had a negative impact instead of what he wanted to have, which was a positive impact with his daughter. But at least he began to recognize it.
That's a great story from M. Scott Peck, the author of The Road Less Traveled, talking about playing chess with his daughter. And she's home from school. It's a chance to catch up and hang out. They've always loved to play chess. And so the goal for the evening, the purpose is to play chess, catch up, and enjoy each other's company. But she had to study for a test. So she said, Dad, it's a little late. I got to go to bed. But he thought she was trying to weasel out of a loss. And so he refused to let her leave. And they got into a huge fight. She went and slammed the door. And he said, my need to win was too great. I thought that was perfect framing for my need to win was too great. And so that win tendency got in the way of the purpose. So he was looking short term, I want to win, but not looking at that long term. What's the purpose of the encounter here? So a perfect example of what we were just talking about.
Yeah, and I think you've hit on it. We have to catch that before it gets to a level 10, because once it's 10, we're not coming out of the I got to win mode. You got to do it when it's low, and you can actually intentionally stop what you're doing and move in a different direction. Because once you're in the throes of it, I don't think you're changing it.
Now, once you're highly emotionally flooded, it's really hard to pump the brakes. So we talk about this ability of, labeling it. Ooh, there's my need to minimize telling me what to do. Or, I feel my need to win. And research, a lot of it out of UCLA, just down the road from me here, shows when you label an emotional reaction, it gives you more control over the reaction. Matthew Lieberman and his team at UCLA call it the brain's braking system. Your emotions are pushing down on the gas pedal. You're getting increasingly irritated. Labeling the reaction is like pumping the brakes. So if you can catch it quickly, So before it's a big deal and label it, it's a lot easier to manage those emotional reactions. You still have them, but the way I frame it is you have your emotional reaction. It doesn't have you. That's a big difference.
It is a big difference for sure. Now, we've kind of already touched on this one, but what role do you think conversational capacity plays in fostering an engaged and adaptive work environment?
Yeah, I think by definition, increases engagement. I have an article on that very subject on my LinkedIn profile on conversational capacity and adaptive engagement. So in an adaptive context where the problems are messy, we don't have a clear way forward. It's something we haven't faced before. There isn't an expert we can call. Learning is the key to progress. And so we need people highly engaged. The challenge is in adaptive situations, the stress levels are high. People have different views of the problem, therefore different ideas about how to move forward. And so often when you need the highest engagement, you get the least. People start getting defensive. They get upset. Factions break out. Arguments begin to occur because you got a lot of people who are passionate and don't see things the same way. So conversational capacity, you could say, is a way to create a pattern of dialogue that allows people with extremely different views of the problem to start learning from each other. And so I think in an adaptive context, that's key. And with high conversational capacity, engagement is almost a natural byproduct, because if we're in a meeting and you say, listen, I got to be honest, Craig, I don't think your idea holds water at all. I don't get upset about that. I see it as interesting. Okay, Clint, tell me more. You're obviously seeing something I'm missing here. What about this doesn't work for you? I'm actually pulling your conflicting idea into the conversation. That is by definition engaging. It's hard for you to walk out and say, I didn't feel very engaged in that conversation when I'm actively trying to pull your views and your ideas and your perspectives into the conversation, not in pursuit of agreement, but in pursuit of learning. Maybe there's an insight there. Maybe there's a spark. Maybe there's some data he's got access to I don't have. So I think by definition, in an adaptive environment where learning is key, we need higher conversational capacity if we need to get people learning across boundaries, ideological boundaries, functional boundaries, geographic boundaries, whatever it might be. So they're kind of pulling together in the service of doing that adaptive learning in a really engaged way.
Right. I have a really close friend that we used to have these conversations, and he convinced me that I won't say the topic because it's too political, but anyway, he convinced me that I didn't think was actually happening. And so I listened to him and I asked a bunch of questions, and in the end I said, okay, I've actually seen that in action now, and I agree that this is happening. Then later on, a few months later, I was bringing up a topic and I was trying to engage with him, and he goes, I said, you're not really engaging and asking me any questions. He goes, I don't need to. I already know I'm right. Like, okay, we can't have these conversations anymore because it's not really a conversation. I'm just talking to you.
Right. I already know I'm right. Yeah, that's a hard place to converse from. That's right.
I think I like the word that I read in the book, and I think you just used as well, and that's the curiosity. And I think the key is you don't have to agree with them. You don't ever have to say that their opinion is right, but you have to at least accept the fact that they have an opinion that's valid to them.
And it may have some substance to it, right? So even if it's 20% right and 80% garbage, that 20% could be really valuable, right? So, all our views are a mix of, two things: evidence. What evidence do I have for my view? And then how am I making sense of that evidence? Some people may have very little evidence and a lot of, making sense. Some people are just the opposite. But it doesn't mean I can't learn from someone who has a very different view. And so I do work with people say, lean into difference. That's a key idea in my work. If you want to engage with people in a way that sparks insight, learning, expands and improves how you're thinking about a problem, it's those people across the table with differing views that are more likely to spark the aha moment. Oh, I never thought of it that way before. That's interesting. And it takes some pressure off you when you realize your goal, your mindset, as we call it, is not about agreement. I'm not trying to find agreement. I'm trying to spark learning. And so it makes it a little easier to engage with people who see the world differently when I don't feel obligated to agree with them. I just want to see what's possible to learn from them.
Yeah, I think that, and I'm going to pull another quote from the book. I was going to mention it later, but now is a great time. It was the one from the Brazilian jazz percussionist, and what he said was, I listen to what's being played, then I play what's missing. And that's really what you're talking about is if you surround yourself with people who play the same instruments you play, the exact way you play them, you're never going to have an orchestra. You're never really going to have something different. You've got to figure out what's missing, and you can have those conversations like you just discussed, which is, let me listen to what you're saying that's different than what I already think. That's going to expand my universe, and we're going to end up with we'll have a conversation, we'll end up with a better project, a better product, a better team dynamic, whatever that might be.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. Where someone says, look, you all know me. I've got a strong finance background and I look at everything through a finance lens. I want to hear from the operations person. What is it your perspective might teach me that I'm missing here? So I actually see people with different functional views as an opportunity to learn. Is there an HR take on this that I'm not paying attention to or I'm downplaying? Is there a safety issue here that I need to be paying more attention to than I am? So I recognize that I've got certain blinders based on my functional expertise, my training, and my personality. And if I engage with others who see the world differently, they can help me kind of recognize the blinders and expand my thinking. Am I obligated to agree with every view? No, not at all. Probably won't agree with most of them. But it doesn't mean I can't actively explore them looking for an insight. So it's kind of like, I would say, if you're in a meeting with high conversational capacity, it's like an Easter egg hunt. Only instead of an Easter egg, it's an insight. Ooh, okay, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of that. I'm going to put that in my notes. So every conversation's an Easter egg hunt.
I like that. I was going to put it in Southern slang, which is, college football is a religion around here, and you don't see the same guy calling offense and defense, right? So you bring in different people with different perspectives for a reason.
Yeah, there you go. Exactly right. Yes, exactly.
So how can leaders build this capacity within their teams to improve decision making?
Yeah, I think that's a really important and kind of a challenging question. So I think a couple of things. There's individual work. People on your team need to be building their conversational capacity. So that means they need to see the value in it themselves. Why would I want to put in the effort to build it? We talk about 3 domains of practice, right? Awareness, mindset, and skill set, the actual behaviors. And we have practices in each of those domains to help people get better at it. But one thing my team and I often say is we can give you the concepts and skills. We can show you the practices. We can actually make out what I think is a fairly cogent argument for why you ought to invest in the work. The only thing we can't do is do the work for you. So one of the things we talk about is we talk about conversational capacity as a conversational martial art. And there's always a risk in framing it that way where people think, oh, that's great. I'm going to use this against a customer tomorrow. But in this conversational martial art, our opponent is not other people. It is not the issue and it is not the context. It's our ego. And if we're going to do a really good job of staying in that sweet spot, focused on learning, thinking more clearly, making smart choices, we've got to do a better job of taking our ego to the mat. So one of the things we talk about is how do you turn your workplace into a dojo? And so the organizations that are doing a good job of really building their capacity over time are looking at their meetings, their decisions, collaborating across boundaries, giving and receiving feedback as a practice space. They're multi-solving. I want to use every meeting to build our conversational capacity, but then the increased conversational capacity circles back and makes our meetings better. I want to use every decision as an opportunity to practice. So you've got individuals who are keeping trigger journals and doing things to build their own capacity, but then they're collectively putting it together in the activities they're already being paid to do. Meetings, decisions, customer service, sales, project management could not be a better. If you're looking for a dojo, that's a really good one. And that's in your wheelhouse because it's really important. It's often not done well, and it's full of activities that require people to communicate and collaborate for it to work well.
100%, 100%. We talk about that. We actually open this podcast every time with the quote from George Bernard Shaw that the single biggest problem with communication is the illusion that it is taking place. Right?
Exactly.
Yes, that's why conversation is so important.
I like Karl Popper, the philosopher, who also said it's impossible to say something in a way where it can't be misunderstood.
That's true.
All you can do is reduce the risk, right? But someone's going to misinterpret something, right? Yeah. So I think that how do you build it? Turn the workplace into a practice space with this very clear focus. I think what you need are 3 things. You need an actionable framework. You need a practice space. And you need the motivation to practice. So you get those 3 things. We got the practice space, we've got an actionable framework, and we see the value in this. So we're going to roll up our sleeves and put in the effort. Those are the 3 things you really need.
Well, that concludes part 1 of my conversation with Craig Weber, founder of the Weber Consulting Group and author of Conversational Capacity, the secret to building successful teams that perform when the pressure is on. Coming up in part 2, Craig gives advice to leaders on how to lift rather than lower the conversational capacity of their team.
Nothing lowers conversational capacity more predictably than the presence of authority. And so if there is what they call in aviation a power gradient in the relationship, trouble starts. People in the junior role, people in the co-pilot seat have a harder time speaking up. So that's a real challenge. So one of the things we talk about with leadership is I need to learn to carry my authority in a way that lifts rather than lowers the conversational capacity of my team. And that takes a lot of work. So the more senior your role, the higher the conversational capacity you need to perform that role well.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation. To find out more about Clint, go to clintonmpaget.com and pick up Clint's book, How Teams Triumph, Managing by Commitment, at Amazon. The Conversation with Clinton M. Paget is a production of Forbes Books.